So maybe we kick it off because we want to stick to 1 hour, allowing everybody to have lunch and also our panelists to have lunch right after the event. A warm welcome. My name is Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of CHAR, and I welcome you all for the next edition of our Out of the Box event series, an agile series we want to offer now and then for an agile lunch talk about a current issue. And you've seen the housekeeping rules. I think no need to run over these once again. Please take a quick look, and no surprises anymore these days. Our starting point today is the outcome of the European elections, which have resulted in the predicted major right-wing populist parties swing and forces which are usually pretty critical of international cooperation, of migration, and of the aid sector. In this light, the outcome of the elections might turn into a major challenge for humanitarians, and the overall new political setup and the new EU Commission might look with very different perspectives into the whole aid policies, etc. Let alone if we look a bit forward in case European powers like France anytime soon might have a new government, or, for example, Germany as of next year. So what does this mean for the humanitarian world? For this, we are really happy to have two great guests who are really experts on this topic for the next hours, namely Klaus Sørensen, the former Director General of DG ECHO, which is the humanitarian arm of the Commission, and by that in a given year always the top 2 or top 3 humanitarian donor of the world. Very warm welcome, Klaus.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining, Klaus. Plus, we are more than happy to welcome Cecilia Rosselli. She's the director of one of the world's top 5 humanitarian INGOs in Geneva, the Norwegian Refugee Council. I believe it's fair to say that there is no NGO which has more expertise and capacity on humanitarian policies. And of course, Geneva is a key hub in the European arena. So welcome, Cecilia.
Thank you, Ralf, and very pleased to be with you.
Thanks for joining. In parallel to Europe's political shift, political narratives have also moved to a very critical perspective on the aid sector. Narratives about the ineffectiveness of aid and if it should be a political priority in times of domestic challenges. These critical perspectives have reached also political and media mainstream in Germany and beyond, including major issues of fake news, etc. And it's questioning a previous consensus about the value of the sector and its independence. For the humanitarian sector, this is a major challenge. It raises also the issue of how Europe, which is in some of the number world's top 1 humanitarian donor, might change directions in the humanitarian aid policies in the years to come and how to counter the outlined perceptions. And for this, there's a lot of renewed talk about, for example, more positive narratives. However, there's also a silent agreement. And as we sense it, there's an agreement that the sector requires indeed major reforms. Also to counter right-wing narratives of waste and ineffectiveness. For example, as we will discuss in a minute with respect to much better needed coordination and alignment of European humanitarian policies and reforms. This leads to a couple of guiding questions on today's topic, and we'd like to start with one on the current political momentum and asking in the first place, Klaus, if you could share a bit from your insights in Brussels still and your previous connections on the latest news about European elections and the new power balances in the Parliament and upcoming in the Commission. What's the bigger picture? Will humanitarian aid and its budgets get even more under pressure, and what might be the effect on that side? Over to you.
Well, I think we're all quite concerned, and there's a lot of worry going around that we hear in all the conversations. I mean, generally speaking, Europe as a geopolitical actor is under pressure. It's very difficult to speak with one voice. We have made progress, but we are still not there. It's very difficult to see how we will act on the foreign policy scene, including, of course, on development and humanitarian. This being said, I don't want to go into a complete depression at this moment. We have to see how it pans out in the European Parliament, and obviously, as you also said, in our member states. let's take a little step back. Obviously, what will happen over the next coming months is going to be crucial. I'm very happy that you also mentioned the critical voices about the efficiency and the delivery. I think this is a box that the humanitarian system should be able to tick by really joining forces, not only in being more accountable, more effective, more cost conscious. I mean, all our organizations are going through a review of their efficiency and setting benchmarks and so on. So I'm pretty confident that on that front we can actually show a pretty good face. On the other issues where the balance will bring us, I would say now something. It's not that I'm not worried. I'm worried as all of you. I'm really worried. But I also have to say that when we look at the political traditions of the right, I'm not talking about the complete lunatics, but I'm talking Senate, even a little bit more right of the center right. Traditionally, they value some Christian values, and I'm not very happy that we should hear voices that we only give to Christians then in the recipient country. Not at all, because obviously we have these notions of humanity in all big civilizations and all big, but they have a rhetoric that actually say we have to help. I mean, this goes across the board, and I think we have to hold people onto that. I mean, are they believing in these basic? This is one aspect. The other aspect, which is a little bit more cynical or pointed, is that if you want a more competitive Europe, a more secure Europe, and more strategic autonomy, which I think is what is on the mind of the leaders, then on the issue of security, humanitarian assistance, I know my colleagues don't like to hear that, but I mean, it is also an element in providing stability. I mean, let's face it, if you have a bunch of millions of people without food, without this, without that, they will go on the move. They will turn up as refugees. So you have actually a link to the refugee question, you have a link to the climate question. And I don't believe they're so idiotic that to believe that this doesn't exist. It exists. And I think we have to overcome our own inhibitions on that issue and say, well, there is a link, guys. Secondly, or thirdly, because I mentioned climate and refugees, the link to health and pandemics. It's not so long ago that people started understanding that if we don't give basic health services, or if we don't have systems to detect that a pathogen is prospering, as we saw it with Ebola and so on, then there's a problem. So I think politically, we should be able to put up a narrative that shows the upsides on efficiency and also on policy delivery. Now, if we will succeed, we'll see, but it requires work from all of us.
Okay, many thanks, Klaus. So you count on the interest-driven motives which might protect the humanitarian sector for the years to come. Cecilia, what is your sense in Geneva? How is the humanitarian sector discussed? Is there a new urgency, a feeling to come more and more under pressure at this key European hub?
Thank you, Ralf, and also thank you for the very good introduction you made earlier. I think NRC is engaging as many other organizations on this topic. They bring a diverse perspective to the picture because we are diverse, and what makes follow the multiple moving pieces. But there are many other colleagues that are engaging. What we see in Geneva, where I'm based, I think we alternate moments where there is a sense of panic, total panic for the situation that we are facing due to the multiple crises that we experience, but also the change in the tone and in the level of engagement and appreciation from donors. So we alternate that to moments where business as usual prevails. And this depends much on the availability and prospect of funding that the different agencies are experiencing on the moment. So one can also define this a bit as schizophrenic, because we really go from the extreme to the other. The multiple independent reviews that we see are implemented and published are pointing to need to change the system. The reviews are happening at country level. They're looking at our operations, the way we work. They are looking at the different elements that makes the humanitarian system what it is. So they are pointing to a need for changing leadership, the need for changing in the way we look at accountability, the way we look at accountability to affected population, the way we action. So we really, our capacity to take up the task are help us keeping people safe. Tools that we are using at the moment, and the ways we face the multiple crises that I already mentioned, but also the different kind of crises that we are confronted with, that more often are becoming protracted. So there is a lot of request for this change to happen. And it's also worth mentioning that the system has evolved during the years, and we now have more than 120 million people that are forcibly displaced. Klaus was mentioning refugees. We also have internal displaced that are adding to the challenge that we have to cope with. This is nearly 3 times what we had in 2004 when the system was designed as it is now. So only by that we will need to act and take some change. In addition, there is a call for prioritizing the crisis that we are investing time and energy on, and a call to prioritize the needs within those crises. This is coming also from donors, EU member states included. The process that we have started last year, led by OCHA, was a bit rushed, but brought us to some changes and some cleanup, I would say, in terms of numbers that we are proposing for analyzing the needs and then develop the planning that goes with it. So going back to your question, if there is a sense of pressure, this, I think, sense of pressure that sometimes emerges seems to disappear as soon as we are looking at real change. As soon as we are pushing for changes in the way we work, change of individual agencies, focus on the way we are, the sense of urgency is declining. Approach. And where I think that there is a role to play by European member states, by donors at large, to really engage and make sure that we alter the way we work to be more effective. This is also included in the Council conclusion that the EU Council conclusion that looked at how to address the funding gap. Efficiency is key if we really want to use the resources that we have that are scarce and possibly are going to become even more scarce going forward. So there are few suggested options that we can look at in terms of what the EU member states can maybe do better or do increasingly more. Happy to elaborate on those now or maybe along the conversation.
Many thanks, Cecilia. Maybe jumping on these over the course of the discussion. And many thanks for the interesting perspective. If I get you right, there is a paradoxum that the pressure is rising on humanitarian actors, but once you try to direct this to pressure for reforms, it's lost, and the pressure is rather decreasing. And key actors, for example, on the donor side, are shying away from your asks, if that's a fair summary. Many thanks for this first round on the political momentum we see right now. I mean, overall, there's a consensus. We hear that humanitarian actors need to align much better against these perceptions and the new narratives and attacks on humanitarian aid and principles and its independence. And also due to our latest research and analysis, this is the more important if we talk about humanitarian aid. And happy to share a few slides on that one. Why is that? A few graphs and quotes from a latest chart paper on what we call the Influencer Europe might illustrate what we see as key challenges. So on one, why is Europe at all so important for everything we talk about? For one, often underestimated in some, it's the world's largest humanitarian donor, as you can see on the left graphic. And also if you look into overall ODA, it's the lone Europeans who are overperforming. If you look at the average OEDC DAC countries, how much they spend compared to GNI on the ODA side. Second, there's a lot in the next graph. We can see there's a lot of talk about shrinking budgets, humanitarian budgets and ODA budgets. And on the next slide, we could see that there are a few European donors who actually are countering the trend with increasing budgets of European states, some of them triggered by investments in migration and refugee hosting, etc., but also some on the core humanitarian funding with new laws on that side, for example, in France and Spain established. So Europe is a key payer. What about the perception on the next slide of Europe as a player? We did a survey a while ago as CHAR with international stakeholders, how important are, for example, European donor countries on the policy side. And apart from the US being leading, not surprisingly, you can see that the boxes are ticked for mainly all European top donor countries. So they have a great influence as a player. Having said that, when we ask in interviews for our paper on the Influencer Europe, what is made out of it, sharing a few just representative, very blunt quotes from a couple of colleagues. One, a European diplomat, sharing very bluntly, coordination potential is tremendously underused on the EU level. Another one sharing from another diplomat from a donor countries, saying that it's so obvious that fragmented donor structures allow aid organizations to get away with major issues, that there's very little leverage to really make UN agencies or top INGOs change on very key structural issues, often, for example, locally led action named on that side. And the final one from a former top donor representative sharing, aid agencies often believe donors are a mysterious aligned body. In fact, donor coordination meetings are mostly chaotic and pointless. There are significant strategic reasons not to cooperate. So also indicating that it's not also only about personal issues, about lack of time and resources. Often also key issues motivate, for example, national donor governments not to coordinate on some key points. Next slide, please. Overall, we looked also into what are the humanitarian hubs, if you want to call it like that, in Europe, and shared some information how fragmented this still is. I mean, there have been major efforts in past years to make Brussels a humanitarian hub, allowing for better humanitarian coordination also on a daily level. But if we look, for example, on where are the top 20 UN agencies and INGOs based, the largest number of them by now, it's actually Berlin with 18 out of 20 top agencies being based there, and a similar number in Brussels, London, Geneva. If you look where is on the donor side, where is humanitarian staff based in agencies for allowing true cooperation, coordination on a daily level, in-person meetings, etc. Actually, it's only Geneva, as you can see on the right bottom, which is lacking in any given other capital in Europe. And if you look into think tanking, research capacities, etc., accompanying top donors and allowing policy discussions and safe rooms for frank discussions, etc. Again, now and there, you have a couple of think tank hubs, but again, in particular, Brussels really lacking this capacity. And the final slide, how that results in coordination fora we looked into. And there, it's an obvious outcome when we weighted what we heard in the interviews, how the more formal fora are for coordination, for example, the COHAFA, which of course in formal terms is the one for coordinating EU members, how little importance it has if you hear what people say involved. While very informal groups like the Stockholm group are pretty influential. But coming back to that one, and of course, it's a very exclusive one, and even many experts here in this talk might have never heard about it because it's a pretty exclusive shop. So overall challenge on that one is that what we analyzed is on the strategic level of coordination, as political science puts it, there are some fora which allow for information sharing, very few to allow thematic coordination on a few issues, especially on ad hoc emergencies, and no fora at all for strategic coordination on reform issues, on major policy issues really to drive reform. And that's by nature a key issue as we analyze that one. The final point overall, if you take the two examples of COHAFA and the Stockholm group, there is a big issue that on the one hand, you might have a very inclusive fora like COHAFA with all 27 EU members on the table, but it's very ineffective. It's very inclusive, but very ineffective. And you have very exclusive shops like the Stockholm group or the bilaterals or the group of Nordics, etc., which are very exclusive and more effective on the other side, but do nothing. Klaus, moving back to you, if you hear a bit what we heard in our interviews in Brussels and put in our paper, in which ways is this matching your personal experience from your Brussels past and what you hear today?
Well, I'm not sure my Brussels past is very relevant because it's a bit dated these days, but I have to say that a number of the assertions that were made ring a bell with me. It's clear that there is an underutilized potential. It's absolutely clear. I can only encourage my former colleagues, and I know that they are doing it, to continue to do their best in making sure that there is a joined up approach, strategy. We have come some way with Team Europe in making statements and so on and so forth, but I'm still hoping for a much more systematic alignment, first an intellectual discussion about where do we want to go, do we all agree, based of course on good analysis of needs and good analysis of the mechanics, but then trying to determine where can we actually push together, and then make sure that it's not only in COHAFA, but it's also in the coordination meetings before the agencies, the boards of the different agencies are meeting. It should actually also, and I'm sure it happens, be before the meetings of the Grand Bargain. Now we have our good friend Michael Köhler there. It has to be used as a potential to influence, and it's also about bringing together, and I know this is done, the directors general or the bosses from member states in Brussels or wherever, I don't care where we meet, or where they meet, but making sure that there's political alignment in their minds. And this really want to push for system change. If you want flexible financing, if you want better risk sharing, and now I'm actually mentioning two items where it's not about the NGOs and the agencies to reform, it's about donors to stop misbehaving, and et cetera, et cetera. So there is a challenge. That's why we tried to make the Grand Bargain, because both the donor side and the NGO side, they have to, and the agency side, they have to do their best to reform in order to become more efficient. So I couldn't agree more. Let's go for it and use that to show that everybody wants to be more efficient. I mean, honestly, if you have a crisis, I would like to see our European donors to take their different parts of the case load. I mean, some are better in gender, some are better in climate related, some are better here, some are better there. And let's have a common approach to all of that. Mm-hmm. Vast subject, but with a huge potential, huge potential.
Many thanks, Klaus. Quickly coming back to you in a second, somebody asked in the chat about the Stockholm group, confirming that it's not that well known in the community. And a colleague kindly shared already from the paper the definition, but in a nutshell, it's a top 5 donor group of ECHO, Sweden, Germany, and UK, and with the US added on top to make it meaningful with the #1 donor. But in this sense, a very informal group meeting once or twice a year and only occasionally taking other ones on board. Klaus, quickly coming back to what you mentioned on UN accountability, coordination ahead of board meetings, and maybe the COHAFA. Quickly, what is your experience? Why? Because if you talk to some people defending coordination, of course they say, well, we do align the night before over dinner, or COHAFA is meeting and has this role. But what's the downside? Why isn't it functioning, either the informal coordination to make sure there is one stance in a UN meeting in a body, for example, not allowing a major UN agency to tap into the next area and to do more mandate creep, or in the COHAFA, either or comment, whatever you like.
Well, I think member states are here to stay, and the Commission is here to stay. So let's not pretend that we can change the fact that this is a question of goodwill on all sides. And then you need leadership. You need 2 or 3 people that really want to run with the ball. It's exactly like what we see in football. You need the game initiators, and then you need the support. But you need some people that are thinking out of the box and that go for it and say, okay, here we have the strategic objectives. This is what we want to do. Are you in agreement? If you're not, tell us why, and then we shape, etc. So this is about sort of doing it. I mean, doing it with enthusiasm. There has to be a lot of umph coming from everybody to do it, and we know that when we see it, we know that it works. Mm-hmm. But I just want to say another thing. We will not become the American donor. I mean, a lot of the budgets come from our member states. This is how we are constructed, and that will probably be for many years to come. So we need to give member states also the space to be proud of what they're doing, and then to herd the cats in order to have the biggest impact.
So it's a difficult balance between national interest, national visibility, which was one of the reasons one interviewee said there's also strategic reason not to cooperate, but apparently hard to overcome for various reasons. Cecilia, how would you see it? I mean, would you see some best and some worst examples of coordination? When is it flying? I'm sure you know some examples when it is flying. And what are the structural reasons for not functioning on key topics, for example, on the financial side?
Thank you, Ralf. And also thank you for pointing out the relevance of Geneva as a place where you have all the constituencies together. And the Grand Bargain is, like it or not, the only platform where we all sit together and where we are able to discuss some of these topics. And that is also the place where I saw some best practices and maybe examples of where things did not fly necessarily. But before I go to that, sorry, I just wanted to comment on what Klaus just mentioned about the enthusiasm, because I think that is extremely important to make sure that things are driven somewhere. And I see more and more situations in which the Team Europe in Geneva is putting statements. It is indeed showing certain level of coordination in advance to UN governing bodies where there are collective statements put together, but then we need to stick behind those statements to make sure that there is really enthusiasm to take things forward. So that is just one comment to what Klaus was saying. So going back to the experience, I can share one practical example of how things have evolved thanks to donor coordination. That is in relation to the efforts we made within the Grand Bargain to advance on coordination of cash assistance. That was an issue, a problem that was on the table since several years, and there were challenges from all different parts of the system to advance in finding a solution. And there, the fact that donors were able to come together in a small room with enthusiasm, putting forward a solution, has allowed to advance on a conversation. And there was a full alignment on the solution that they wanted to push forward. And I really think that helped immensely in identifying a way forward in how to coordinate cash assistance on the ground. When you don't have a clear problem statement, or when you don't have a clear drive from the donors and the actors that are involved, then the coordination stalls a bit. And if I may add a couple of opportunities where I see that greater coordination across the member states in Europe would help, I would like to highlight three. So one, again, I mean, reinforcing the push that could be put behind all the different processes associated with the UN. Yes, that's one. Second, member states are shareholders of development banks. So there again, if they would come together as member states of the EU, they would have a lot to say to push development banks to stay and deliver in context where we see crisis emerging and where we have unconstitutional change of government. NRC has done a lot of studies around this, happy to share further in the chat if useful. Third element where I see that they could play a role is when member states are coming together to contribute to pooled funds and to contribute to pooled funds to address climate issues that were also mentioned by Klaus. There as well, member states have a role to play and could be a fantastic driver for change if aligned in a different way. And then the last point is more of a dream from my side. One of the themes around which I would welcome more alignment is how funds are distributed in an equal manner. And I state and agree on different level of interests within the different, and allow for a better equity by those crises that are neglected. We would be able to avoid the neglect. It's just a question of coming together and accept that each member state has to take one on board, and then we would be able to do better.
Many thanks, Cecilia. It's striking that on the very interesting topics you put on the table, most of them are rather non-political, and power balances don't play such a big role between donors and between donors and agencies, apart from the UN accountability side, maybe. But development banks, pooled funds on the technical side, where a lot of scope, definitely many people would surely identify. Does this mean in some to allow for a start better coordination on the European side, we need to be very pragmatic and rather shift around the more political issues and the more power related issues like the institutional issues with the nexus, not flying in any given key donor country, one might say. On the UN side, governments need to join forces if they really want to cause change and not allow top agencies to go shopping from one to the other if it's not accepted what's put on the table. Is that a next step needed to be, for a start, very pragmatic on some of the policy pragmatic issues and not too much touch on the power issues?
I would not shy away from the more complex and political topics, because we do need coordination around humanitarian diplomacy. We do need coordination around the issues that we face to get out of different crises where we work. But I would also adopt a pragmatic approach. So while we still debate how to move forward on those more complex topics, we have room to make progress on less contentious issues. Accountability to affected population is another one, for instance, that very pragmatic. We are all in agreement. We all want to make it happen. We all full our mouth of the need to put people at the center. So let's do it. Let's come together and agree from a donor perspective, what are the three main things we want to see happen? And let's use the tools that the system has already developed to make it happen. I don't want to look too simplistic in this approach, but I think that there are some low-hanging fruits that we should try and push for. The same applies to a certain extent or to quality funding, which is another topic that I think we have made some progress in the past to increase flexibility and predictability in funding. And it's something that we have now deprioritized. And we see an increased demand for donor conditions coming from the political level. So that is something that I believe that as EU donors, as advanced EU donors, we could continue to put on the agenda and find some ways to move forward. The last point that I made earlier about neglected crisis, I also think is something that could potentially be taken into consideration when donors are coordinating, and in particular when they are coordinating in advance to engagement with development banks or pooled funds.
Very quick follow-up question before moving back to you, Klaus. Cecilia, on this question of power balances, of course, we often like to talk a lot about the big UN agencies and the donors. Some interviews also indicated, well, for us as an INGO, we would also of donors making us accountable, for example, to move the side on accountability of affected population. This is a game everybody probably needs a more coordinated donor side to move also internally.
Yeah, this is another topic that for me would probably allow us to move faster if we would have a pressure coming from donor, and the pressure that is that makes sense. So I think there would be a need to have a pragmatic debate about that. Not everything can be done by local actors. There is a role for everyone, but there are tools that we can together put in place to allow for local actors to be able to better respond to the needs on the ground. So you have served me on a silver plate something in relation to the use of overheads for local actors. I think it's extremely important that donors come together and coordinate to allow for cascading of overheads to local actors. My own organization has done something that was considered impossible already 2 years ago. We have introduced a policy that allows us to transfer overheads to local actors to allow them to grow and do the job that they are requested to do. So if the could come together and make sure that this is happening for everyone, and we are able to cascade these overheads as an additionality to the grants that we receive from donors, it would be a quick win for everyone.
Many thanks, Cecilia. Klaus, before encouraging everybody attending to share any comments or questions in the chat, because we would have time to raise them if of interest. Klaus, maybe moving to you again on which issues you think are key, and sharing maybe this point, I mean, of the crisis, while at the same time, for example, feedback has been coordination in some ways is functioning, but for example, on the hard power issues, on finances, on funding allocation, that's the greatest challenge and hardly doable if you try to coordinate EU member states. Is that matching your experience, or what would you see as best opportunities to better coordinate and reform?
Well, I think I definitely would avoid a kind of power conflict with member states or with the Commission, different services and so on. I think we have to be, as it was said, pragmatic. But I say so because I believe that if you explain to each other, if we explain to each other what is our common interest, is it really our common interest to let go of the most fragile states in the world because we have to put all the money in Ukraine? No, it's a very short-term kind of reasoning. So we have to keep up some funding, considerable funding in sub-Saharan Africa. Just to give an example, this is not because there's a power game. It's because it's logical. Obviously, everybody, the Commission institutions, member states, they face a public uproar when there is something popping up like the war in Ukraine or Gaza, for that matter. But it should not prevent us from having a robust discussion about what is our fundamental medium to long-term interest. And that is obviously something that should lead to a joint messaging and the joint, I mean, Cecilia mentioned humanitarian diplomacy, obviously use our different channels. I was very happy that Cecilia mentioned the development banks. We have neglected for many years to actually talk to our member states representatives in the development banks, and I don't see why shouldn't we have this conversation with them and then get on with it. So just one thing, a lot of people are saying that the nexus is moribund or dead and so on. I think it would be very wrong to not to try but to continue to try to combine development financing with humanitarian financing and programming based on risk assessments that have to be common. This is another subject that I would hope would stay on the agenda, because I do believe that also with the funding constraints we have, that we still have to make the development assistance more risk and vulnerability sensitive. And again, it's common sense. Even the World Bank understands that. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it on the basis of what is efficient for our objectives and the goals we have together.
Klaus, maybe coming back to this point on its common sense, and probably most people would agree to everything you said. At the same time, it's not moving for decades. And coming back to the question on what the political changes coming up in Brussels and in member states might mean for it, do you think this could help moving such reform? Because there might be a sense of, well, we need to deprioritize institutional interest. We need to deprioritize our organizational interest because overall the sector is getting under more and more threat. We don't know. Or is it the worst time for change because nobody will prioritize these issues? Nobody will be that interested in Brussels to discuss such technical things as many people and players will perceive it.
I mean, if you're not ahead of the curve, you will very soon on the system. Now is the moment to really decide that we want to move forward. And again, it needs some enthusiasm, it needs leadership. We have to understand also a structural problem that we have in member states sometimes, that people change. You know that humanitarian policy is very much decided in capitals, whereas development assistance is a little bit more in the field. And there is a huge turnover. So it's a constant. And I think the Commission is well placed to keep this conversation going with member states, even those that are not big donors and so on. I think they should be in the club as well. But obviously, not primarily, but it's very important to get Germany and France and the Nordics and the Dutch and the Belgians and Italy and whoever are big in this game to get them on board. And this requires work, but it's work that is paying off, because if we have a little bit of a better understanding of who goes where and what, then we cover the whole of the caseload in a much more efficient way. And I think the rest of the world would be happy instead of having to deal with all this monster that speaks with different priorities and so on. They don't understand why we cannot get our act together.
Yes, of course, we can only mirror that from the German perspective, though, again, a long-standing issue. Cecilia, what's your take on what does the current political momentum mean for these areas of reform which get to the heart of institutional interest, organizational interest, power balances? Is it a good time? Because Michael Köhler said in a podcast we did with him lately on European reform, never waste a good crisis. A bit cynical, asking, well, now the pressure is so high that it might allow for reform which people haven't been ready before, including donors, INGOs, UN agencies. Is it an opportunity right now, or do we rather risk to all areas? So no.
back is the report that was called Make It or Break It. It was immediately after the COVID crisis, because we felt that the shock was so big that we would have had to react to it. And then in reality, we managed to continue, if not business as usual, very similar to that. I think I agree with Köhler. I mean, if you have a shock, then you are forced to change. So the shock now is probably not so dramatic all at once. It's more drop by drop. We are losing funding, and we are losing consensus to continue investing on humanitarian aid. So that's why it's more difficult to have this strong reaction. But I really hope that we are able to come together and find a way to adapt the system. We probably don't need a revolution, but we really need to adapt to a world that has changed, and we really need to find the energies to work differently together, because we have to develop a different narrative if we want to continue sustain the budget we have now for humanitarian, and if we want to attract new actors, because that is another area where I feel a concerted effort from member states would be much welcomed, is in the engagement with the so-called non-traditional actors that we all would like to invite to the party, but we do that kind of individually. And I really think a concerted effort would be beneficial to everyone. We are living in a world where protection crises are so big and so exacerbated that coordination is really needed. I really welcome donors have come together now to create a group to coordinate, to address the major protection issues. So that's something positive, not to always be too negative. So that's an area where Germany is involved. We have Sweden leading together with Switzerland. So it is an opportunity that we have to come together, but we have to be bold in what we ask for changing.
Many thanks. Touching a bit, especially on the prioritization debate going on right now, and asking, well, what could be the effect if donors, Stephanie Koopman is asking, if donors keep asking for more efficiency, for faster responses, for even stricter due diligence, etc., for example, also with local partners. Do you sense already a push in this direction on your programming side? And is there a downside that this efficiency debate might lead to, for example, prioritization, which doesn't make sense from a program level, but maybe from a donor accountability level in a symbolic way? How do you see this development?
I mean, the pressure is there. We definitely see more requirements. We see more demands in terms of providing information and providing the accountability that is needed. And we definitely see a push for prioritization from all sides. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, there is an effort put in place by OCHA to put this boundary setting to limit not the scope of humanitarian aid, but to limit the capacity that as humanitarian actors we have to react with the little funding that we have. So we really have to be very careful in how we follow exercises, because the risk is really to leave people behind. And that's why it's extremely important that NGOs as well as UN agencies engage in this process to avoid that there is a cut that doesn't make sense from a humanitarian perspective. And I really welcome other NGOs to contribute, to come together, to join the sometimes boring and technical working groups that are looking at this, but really important to make sure that we preserve the space that we need in our response. But the push is there. It's coming from donors because there is less money. So we really have to be careful. And we have to be careful that there is not too much influence from politics in the choices that are made.
Many things, Klaus, maybe sharing the question with you as well. I mean, you have a lot of experience from your period. I mean, it's not a new debate. The whole value for money debate, the whole UK push for money and impact measurement, etc., is some years ago. And indeed, that might be one force coming out of the new political changes, asking for more and more evidence. What is the impact, and which is a fair question. But at the same time, of course, raising very difficult questions if it's a waste of money, for example, to fund emergencies which are costly because they are in conflict, because they are in middle-income countries like in the Middle East, etc. What's your experience? What came out of these debates in the past, and what's your take on this question?
I think every donor wants to cover their ass vis-a-vis their budgetary authorities. So if I have one piece of advice, that is to come out first. I mean, for the NGOs to be very proactive on this and demonstrate that what they do actually makes sense. And this is the efficiency into that time to bring go to the last mile, bring the aid, etc., etc. Make sure that the feedback mechanism. The worst thing is to wait to get the question. So be prepared, have it. Go through your own organizations and check whether you can make efficiency gains. I know it's painful. It's lovely to be in an organization when the budgets are going up. It's much less pleasant when the budgets are going down. But it is a survival strategy to be sure that we can document that. And the questions will come. Obviously, they will come. So the other thing is that the donors, I mean, this is why dialogue between the big donor, the Commission, and important member states on the efficiency of our own conditionality is a very important discussion, because if we are nitty-gritty and due diligence here and due diligence there, and the paper is missing, and then the NGO has to pay back, and within the delivery is blocked and so on. It's not efficient. So there has to be a balancing of the risks. It's an age-old discussion, but it's a discussion that I think the donors really should have with each other. Is this the best way of operating in very volatile, fragile situations? How do we deal with that? Share it and be open about it. Obviously, the refusniks in this world would never take the answer for the right answer, but the others will be comfortable that the issue has been addressed.
So in a way, we need to be more open about risks and downsides of aid and its inefficiency in times when it's questioned, to be more transparent.
Well, I always give the advice to people that are bidding for responses and so on, to make clear what the risk factors are. Because if you then run into a problem, you can say, well, sorry, it was actually in the terms of reference. I mean, we have talked about that. There's no secret. Because the problem is, if the shit hits the fan and nobody were aware, I mean, this is not nice. But if we acknowledge the risk and take it up front, it's easier to argue. And mind you, I have been on both sides of this discussion. I know how difficult it is to go to the European Parliament and tell them that, okay, this deviation or détournement of aid, it actually didn't happen. But I also know that it's not everything that can be prevented. I mean, there is a risk out there. We are in very, very difficult settings, and occasionally there's a truck that is lost. But it doesn't mean that the whole operation has to be cancelled, or because if we can demonstrate that we have mitigating policy in place, then even the nastiest budget authority would say, okay, they have done what they could. So you're in a much stronger position, at least.
Right. I mean, surely a key question in the chat as the donor appetite to be more attuned to risks might rather decrease in these political times. And the ask, of course, is just the other way around. Cecilia, one key point on efficiency in the chat, also see on the donor side on non-harmonized reporting, etc. Maybe if you want to touch on that one from the operational side, and Klaus is already laughing, as this is indeed a key point, I guess. Plus, quickly, because we need to conclude in a few minutes, efficiency on the donor side, and that would be a key question for NRC on that one. And there was another one on broadening the donor base on funding, which is of course decreasing as it is forecasted, but broadening the donor base could better European coordination help in this regard as well. Maybe that one for Klaus. For Cecilia on the efficiency side. And the final question over to you, Cecilia.
Yes, thank you. So on the efficiency version is increasing instead of decreasing in particular contexts more than in others. So that is something that has to be taken into consideration. So in addition to the challenges that we were facing when the Grand Bargain was signed in 2026, it's difficult to talk about harmonized financial reporting. Now we also have the fact that the political element is further hampering the road that we want to take. And there, I think we lack the political will to really address this. So there is little that can be done at pragmatic level. This said, the good examples for harmonizing reporting and harmonizing due diligence that were elaborated 3-4 years ago are still there. They are not forgotten, so there is an opportunity to move forward. NRC has updated the catalog on quality funding just for this reason. So we have looked again at all the possible avenues to improve flexibility, and we have offered the menu from which donors can pick and choose if they want to stick to the principles of
many thanks. Indeed, the Germans were the ones pushing for harmonized reporting, but that has not really left the pilot stage, I'm afraid. Klaus, the question on you on broadening the donor base and maybe linking it with a final question. If there was one key issue you would like to recommend to the upcoming new Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid in Brussels, what would be your key ask?
First principle, don't consider them. It's not like you push a button and then money is gone. You need that. And I'm talking in particular of the I'm, as some of you know, I go regularly to the Gulf. The money doesn't come easily, but it does come if they feel respected and part of a group. I mean, it's very much about human contact. And see and talking and so on. So there is a huge potential, and a lot of this potential is not registered anywhere because they don't report into the UN system. So we don't really know, but I can tell you the money is there. So let's not fool ourselves. And one question, yeah, to the commissioner. First of all, I hope that there will be a commissioner for humanitarian aid, and secondly, I mean, again, my old colleagues, they don't like it too much, I know, but I mean, we have to build on the security aspects. I would be very cynical. I would make a very strong argument for humanitarian assistance as a way to help stabilize very fragile situations around the world. And it's not only the commissioner, but I think we are approaching the hearings in the European Parliament, and I hope that everybody are making sure that the right questions are put to the commissioner, so that this link with climate and refugees, with health issues, with stability, and of course compassion, because it is, after all, a European, I think it's very much European value that every human being has an equal value in many other places in the world. So there is a commitment that has to be made. And then maybe we are entering. We used to say that the EU finance bigger because USAID and the others are bigger, but it's stable. Now, there is a little hitch here because we have the multi-annual financial framework. And I think already now we have to ask the commissioner to make sure that the humanitarian budget in the next multi-annual financial framework is not diminished but increased in order to address some of these issues. And this starts now because we have heard what Bardella has said about the EU budget, and we are now not out of the woods yet.
Many thanks, Klaus. And Cecilia, for you, the final question as well. If you had one key request to the new Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, which indeed we hope will be there, would you agree he should focus on human security?
You don't have to agree, Cecilia.
Well, it's a very tricky question to put at the end, Ralf. I think what is important is that the EU does not make the mistake to neglect certain crises, because this may bring a security issue afterwards.
Voila.
You know,
then we're not so much in disagreement. Then it's okay.
So I really think we have to be careful, and we have also to be careful to avoid that. I mean, securing humanitarian budget, yes, but also make sure that we evolve in the way we think about humanitarian assistance, to avoid that we fall into the trap to have certain crises living through a cycle of perpetual humanitarian aid assistance. We have to find solutions. And I really think players.
Many thanks, Cecilia. We need to find solutions. We think that was a perfect final phrase. We all hope. Many thanks for joining. We will continue the series, and we will continuously after summer in Brussels. So we keep going. We touched on a series of topics, and I hope it was interesting. Now time for lunch for the two of you. And many thanks for joining. And many thanks for everybody online. Take care, and many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ralf. Thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.